Good afternoon. My name is Dave Santangeli, your host for the fourth installment of Morrison Park Advisors' Frankly Speaking webinar series. Today's topic is the coming transformation of Ontario's auto industry. As we all know, electric vehicles and electrification, battery technology has become much more mainstream, both in society and in the mainstream media. But what is not often talked about is the implications of the transition to electric vehicles on industry and industrial policy. This is particularly important in the province of Ontario. The automotive supply chain industry in Ontario is literally thousands of companies, almost 100,000 employees, $35 billion of annual output in 2018, and the space represents about 20% of Ontario's manufacturing GDP. As a result, this is a critically important topic to Ontario, to Ontarians, and to Ontario industry. Joining me today to drill down on this topic are two excellent guests. Firstly, Rahul Gangal and Pelino Colaiacovo. Rahul is a partner and the head of the Roland Berger Automotive and Industrial Group based in Toronto. Roland Berger is not as much of a household name as, say, McKinsey or Boston Consulting Group, but based out of Western Europe, Roland Berger is one of the leading strategic consulting firms in the world, and is the leading strategy consulting firm in this space. Also important for those of us in Canada and Ontario is that a very significant percentage of Roland Berger's work in battery technology and electrification occurs in the Toronto office, which is Rahul's area of responsibility, which makes Rahul one of the leading subject matter experts on this topic. And we very much thank Rahul for joining us today. Our second panelist is Pelino Colaiacovo, a longtime partner of ours at Morrison Park. Before joining MPA in the mid-2000s, Pelino's had his roots in economic policy, particularly in the electricity and utility space, having been a primary architect of the current electricity industry regulatory environment in Ontario. Since joining MPA, Pelino's had a varied career, both in terms of working with renewable technologies and renewable technology companies, but also in advising, I'm going to run off the list, province of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Ontario on a number of occasions, Manitoba, Alberta, and BC, not only on specific project assessment roles, but also in overall policy and how to restructure those industries, given the changes of not only generation, but transmission, distribution, and renewable technologies. So great couple of guests. In terms of our format today, we're going to be on the air for about 45 minutes in total. The first half an hour of that will be each of Pelino and Rahul talking about the specific areas that they focus on, followed by 10 or 15 minutes of questions, which will be me pushing these guys a little bit to hear their opinions. So with that, I'd like to pass the mic over to Pelino to talk about the high-level trends in the industry. Pelino?
Thanks, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here today and to be on a panel with Rahul. I very much look forward to this. Automotive manufacturing in Canada and specifically in Ontario has been an enormous industry for us as a country and as a province for over 100 years. As Dave mentioned, in 2018, automotive parts manufacturing alone represented $35 billion of economic value in the province and in Canada. Ontario has traditionally been the very large majority of all automotive activity in Canada, and that's not expected to change. But the industry has been buffeted over the last number of years by some very significant changes and ongoing transformations, which are only expected to accelerate. For example, Ontario produced 3 million vehicles about 20 years ago. But in 2020, that number had dropped to 2 million vehicles. I mean, a decline of a third in the production of automobiles and light duty vehicles in general in the province of Ontario has been an enormous change, because it's not only about the vehicle plants and the assembly of vehicles, but the relationships between vehicle producers and all of their parts suppliers. That has been an enormous and significant change. The automobile industry is fundamentally regional. And so if you look at the NAFTA bloc at Canada, the United States, and Mexico, you're talking about annual production of about 20 million vehicles. And so while Ontario might only be producing 2 of those 20 million, part suppliers in Ontario are supplying not only the local assembly plants, but assembly plants in the United States as well, where 17 of the 20 million vehicles in North America get sold every year. So the parts manufacturing industry is about supplying in Ontario, but also about supplying in the United States. And that 20 million vehicle base in 2019, to be clear, 2020 numbers and 2021 numbers are going to be substantially lower because of the impact of the COVID pandemic. But in 2019, the last pre-pandemic year, we're talking about 20 million vehicle sales. That number is under pressure in a variety of ways. One, because of changes to do with autonomous vehicles and the ownership of vehicles, amongst private individuals, versus potentially in the future autonomous vehicles being part of fleets and so on. But also fundamentally because of the transformation that we're all expecting in the mode of operation, in the fuel. Traditionally, I mean, for the past 100 years, it's all been about combustion. It's been about largely gasoline-driven vehicles, and to some degree also some diesel vehicles, but gasoline the vast majority. And having an engine and a transmission to deliver power to the vehicle's wheels. But that's changing. Now, in that 20 million vehicle sales in 2019, only 3% were electric. For all of the talk and discussion about Tesla and about other manufacturers coming up with electric vehicles, in 2019, it was only 3%. But that is set to change and change fairly dramatically. If we look around at governments and government policies, they're focusing on transportation because of climate change emissions, because of greenhouse gases. If you look at a Canadian example, in Canada, transportation represents 25% of all of Canada's emissions. And light duty vehicles, cars, pickup trucks, SUVs, and motorcycles represent half of the production from the transportation sector as a whole. The other half is buses and trains and freight trucks and aircraft and so on. But 12% of all of Canada's emissions in 2019 came from cars and pickup trucks. And that's just an enormous contribution to the climate change challenge. You cannot address climate change emissions without addressing the transportation sector. And so governments of all stripes all over the world have been looking at how to do that. And we've seen all kinds of announcements, and people make the argument that these announcements are more aspirational than real, but nonetheless, they're announcements about policy and often enshrined in legislation or regulations or agency directives. The first one to get off the mark was California. In September of 2020, California announced a policy where they wanted to have 100% zero emission vehicle sales by 2035. Subsequently, they also announced an interim target of 60% zero emission vehicles sales in California by 2030. This is enormously aggressive. That's also echoed now. We've seen in Canada in January of just this year, Canada following suit and saying, all of Canada is going to sell 100% zero emission vehicles by 2035. They have not yet announced any interim targets in the same way as has happened in California and a few other jurisdictions. But nonetheless, it's a 2035 target. So you're going to go from 3% electric vehicle sales in 2019 to 100% electric vehicle sales in 2035. At least that's the stated policy. And it's not just here. Europe has just announced the same thing. And just a week ago in the Fit for 55 legislative package that the European Commission announced, they also said 100% zero emission vehicles in all of Europe by 2035. So those kinds of policy announcements that governments are making, backed by activity through regulators, is pushing automotive vehicle manufacturers to announce more and more plans for electric vehicles, new models, not only in the car segment, but also in the pickup truck segment, in the delivery vehicle segment, in the motorcycle segment. Vehicle manufacturers are all announcing multiple new products that are intended to be electric vehicles, and therefore fulfill those zero emissions vehicle mandates that governments have been announcing. In Canada, at least, there's also been a push by governments to bring to consumers a much more direct sense of the cost of climate change. And in December, the federal government announced an increase in the plan for carbon taxes. So today, when you go to the pumps and you buy some gasoline for your car, you're paying approximately a 9-cent per liter carbon tax as part of the price of gasoline that you buy. But by 2030, that number is going to rise 37.5 cents. So if you look at the price today at the pumps, you'd be adding another 30 cents on top of what you're currently paying per liter for gasoline for your car. And this is going to become a bigger and bigger incentive for people, particularly people who happen to drive longer distances every day, to switch away from a gasoline or a diesel-powered vehicle and move to an electric vehicle. On top of the government regulatory targets about changing what auto companies sell, there's also going to be the issue about what people really want to buy, right? Because if it costs you more to drive a gasoline powered vehicle, you're going to want to switch. So both that regulatory push and a demand pull are going to be dragging the automotive industry away from combustion vehicles and towards electric vehicles. And what does that really mean? Well, it means an enormous change, especially for parts suppliers, because if you're going to take the engine and the transmission and the emissions control system out of a car and replace it with a battery and one or more, could be anywhere from 1 to 4 electric motors, possibly with no transmission, certainly with no emission system, with no mufflers. What you're doing is you're taking thousands, literally thousands of parts out of a vehicle and replacing them with different parts, typically a lot fewer parts. And so automobile manufacturers and automobile parts manufacturers are facing a massive change in the industry. It's a secular change, really, where it's a full disruption of the industry. Yes, cars are still going to have wheels. They're still going to have tires. They're still going to have body panels. If you're not talking about autonomous vehicles, they're still going to have steering wheels. But in the future, instead of having 35,000 parts in a car, it'll be 10,000 parts in a car, right? And who's making those 10,000 parts? And what exactly do they look like? And which production line are they going to be produced on? And if you're a parts manufacturer today, a really interesting challenge is going to be, how do you go from 3% electric to 100% electric? When you get to that balance where 50% of new cars being sold are electric, but 50% are still combustion, and we will go through that kind of a transition. It will not be 0 to 100 overnight. It's going to be a few percentage points increase every year in electric vehicle sales. It means that the auto companies, the actual assemblers, are going to have two parallel lines of supply chains. They're going to have a combustion vehicle supply chain and an electric vehicle supply chain going at the same time for a period of years. And that's going to be incredibly difficult, and it's going to tax all of the relationships between automotive suppliers and original equipment manufacturers and vehicle assemblers. And how are companies going to work through that? How many new investments are going to be required? How many mergers and acquisitions, and how much industry consolidation is going to be required to go through that process? And for an industry, excuse me, for an industry that produced $35 billion worth of goods just in Canada a couple of years ago, are we still going to have $35 billion worth of goods shipped 10 years from now? Different goods, but nonetheless automotive-based goods. Or is it going to even be more? But for the companies that are currently in the sector, are you going to be able to take your existing investment and transition it into new investments for new parts that are still going to be required for the industry? I don't think anyone is expecting sales of vehicles to collapse. There's still going to be vehicles produced. People are going to still use vehicles. People still want personal autonomy that comes from having access to vehicles. But the nature of those vehicles is going to be different. And the challenge for the automotive parts manufacturing industry in Ontario is to make sure that they continue to have a sizable slice of that pie. And that means new investment, reinvestment, focus on new products while still maintaining all their relationships. It's going to be a challenging period. Now, governments have come out because, let's not forget, governments are mandating these changes in the automotive sector. So governments have felt the obligation to come out with some programs to try and assist in this transition. And so both the federal government and the Ontario government have announced a variety of different programs measuring up into the billions of dollars, where they are supporting strategic investments in new capacity, electric vehicle related capacity. But that's quite likely a drop in the bucket compared to the total investment that's going to be required to shift over from combustion related vehicles to electric related vehicles. And that's not a surprise, because this is a private sector business, right? It's driven by private sector investments to produce goods that are largely purchased by consumers across North America. And so billions are going to have to be invested in this transition. And, I think parts manufacturers in Ontario are going to want to be focused on where those billions are coming from and what the terms of those transactions are going to be. So that's just a little bit, I think, of the overview and background, but Rahul is obviously going to dig much deeper into it.
Okay, so now that you've scared everybody, let's pass the microphone over to Rahul to try and drill down a little more specifically in a number of these factors. Rahul?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to talk on this topic. Since it's the season of sport, let me try explaining it from a sporting analogy. Some years ago, people used to ask me, what's the difference between the way business is done, let's say in Americas, Asia, and Europe? And I used to, originally from India, so that context used to be often thrust upon me. And I used to say the best way to understand it is to understand the sport that a country follows. The sport that's followed in large parts of the world is typically lasting 90 minutes. And with a definite result, they'll give you an extension of another 30 minutes and another 15 minutes, but they'll force a result upon you. The sport that India loves is a sport that lasts for 5 days, Test cricket. It's a very different mentality. Now, I've had to change that analogy in the recent past because I recently discovered that the most popular sport in the world is actually now computer games or e-games. And they typically last 20 minutes. So the world that I was living in, where my favorite sport used to last 5 days, is very different from the sport that my children are growing up in. For their favorite sport is lasting 20 minutes. I think the same is happening with the automotive industry. Canada's automotive industry is still playing test cricket, but the world is shifting to electronic games. And unless we can switch our game, we might be extinct. Now, let me lay it out in a little more detail. And the way I understand it is in the form of a grid. On one side, there are actors, and on the other side, there are causes. There are three prominent actors in the automotive business, actually four. There is the auto OEMs, the suppliers, the automotive aftermarket, and the retailers. And the fifth actor is the customer, but that's definitely one that we'll touch upon later. On the axis of causes, there are many axes, but we primarily group them into four major trends: mobility, autonomy, electrification, and digitization. And these have interplay which is happening at different levels. Now let's take how the automotive suppliers have been behaving globally first. If you look at how they have been operating till 2009, they were reflecting the financial crisis. That's why you had global light vehicle production, which was around 60 million in that year, units. 2009 to 2016, suppliers actually grew phenomenally when the vehicle market itself expanded to 93, 95 million. It topped up in 2017 at 95 million. There was already a slowdown that was starting to happen because of two trends. One, electrification; two, autonomous vehicles; actually three, third, shared mobility. And so suppliers were already adjusting to crisis before COVID hit. Now, what has COVID done for them? And how does this play up in electrification? Pelino was very cogent about the fact that you're reducing the number of parts. You're also reducing the number of jobs. A traditional automotive supply chain used to have one manufacturing job and 4 jobs upstream or downstream. Electrified supply chain has one manufacturing job and 2.5 jobs upstream or downstream. And they may not necessarily be the same jobs. Now, take, for example, an exhaust pipe or a fuel tank or structural parts that are manufactured for ICE engines. Where do those guys go? What does it mean for suppliers of these products, which will be very soon obsolete? What happens to gas pumps? Will they start distributing electricity as charging stations? Will they need to be repurposed? What happens to customers who are still not excited about the product? What happens to components like brakes, which are moving from drum to disc? What's happening to electrification of steering columns, which is moving from pneumatic to electrical? So there is going to be massive product shift that we are expecting in the automotive supplier space coming out of electrification. And they are responding to it in 4 ways. At the first way is that we are already starting to see the first level of supplier bankruptcy hitting us. It was starting to hit even as early as 2018-19, but it's only aggravated now. And what it is doing is it's weaning out suppliers whose product mix is not suiting this electrified market, or product mix of suppliers who already had flawed business models before this crisis hit. The second is we are starting to see consolidation. So there is much more focus on M&A and type discussions, which were on hold till some time ago, have suddenly started coming back. There's much more capital starting to flow. And that reflects an increased capital market interest today. But that is not directly happening with suppliers, but also happening with the technology lens, because we're starting to see a whole new form of manufacturers coming in. We had a recent example in Canada where an automotive OEM did not choose another automotive supplier to manufacture the first batch of vehicles, but actually chose a robotics supplier to manufacture a first batch of vehicles. Now, that makes the whole story very, very interesting. And last of all, we'll see some level of portfolio optimization because almost all suppliers are today reviewing portfolios in light of changing market trends. Now, this is coming down the value chain. So tier ones are already doing it, and most of them are in the process of having executed the plans. But let's understand the story for tier one is different for tier two to tier three. A tier one supplier and the large ones in Canada are larger than some of the OEMs. They have access to great financing. They have business models that are well understood by the financial community. They have a wide industrial base that's geographically dispersed, but also product dispersion is there on that industrial base. What happens to tier two and tier three suppliers is they do not enjoy all the other envelope benefits that are available to the large suppliers. As a result, there is going to be asset repurposing that they would need to do, but they would not get the kind of financial support that they need. Because the traditional channels of banks and private equity will not understand the new models that they have to do. They would not be able to invest and build in the kind of skills that need to be done, that need to be brought in if you have to go into this electrified future or a digital future or an autonomous future. They would not be attractive as assets that need to be sold out as a garage sale, because there is really no future for some of these assets in the manufacturing value chain. Added to it is the complexity that whilst Canada is a large market in its own right, it's actually a production market that's very intricately linked to what happens in the US. 90% of our products are exported to the US. So what happens if the new presidency in the US has an overwhelming EV focus, distorts the manufacturing story in Canada much more than it does in the US. And all of this is leading us into the same situation where we are still playing test cricket, but the market is actually asking us to play electronic games. So with those opening remarks, I'll pass it back to you. And we could delve deeper onto each of these issues.
Thanks, Rahul. My first question, I'm going to push this on a Pelino just because I'm a skeptic. Pelino, you use the word aspirational with respect to targets. You know, and my own personal view, I mean, I've long been something of a skeptic with respect to, you know, government's real ability to really grapple with politically difficult challenges. And, you know, climate change has been one of those. So when you use the word aspirational, what I hear is politically expedient. I guess the question I have is, you know, to what extent can we actually rely on the pace of change being what people say it's going to be? Or is this just going to be another series of announcements which really don't happen? And what is it that's going to stop this from slowing or reversing?
Well, I think it's important, a couple things. It's important to understand that Canada, at least, and even California, they're not the most aggressive targets in the world. I mean, Canada's announcement about a 2035 target mirrors California's, but some jurisdictions, the UK and Ireland and Denmark, already announced 2030 as a target. Norway is 2025. They're going to sell 100% zero emissions vehicles by 2025. They're already at almost 50% in Norway. Now, the issue is not the possibility, the technical possibility of selling those vehicles. It's certainly there. There are a bunch of electric vehicles that are being, you know, offered for sale today. The issue is cost, right? These vehicles are more expensive. The infrastructure, the grid infrastructure to support large-scale mass electrification is not there. Rahul mentioned gas stations. We have thousands of gas stations in Canada, God knows how many tens of thousands of gas stations across all of North America. You can drive anywhere and you can be confident that you're not going to have to run out of gas. There's always a gas station nearby, regardless of which road you're on. That's not the case if you have an electric vehicle. And so if we want to get to 100%, I mean, it's a combination of things that have to happen, and they're expensive. All of it's going to require capital investment, both by automotive purchasers, by automotive producers, and by the whole infrastructure around to support roads and highways that are going to be, carrying electric vehicles. So it's aspirational in the sense that, have people really grappled with the cost? But, Canada is not leading the way. There are some other jurisdictions that are leading the way.
So just on that, Pelino, so maybe I can ask Rahul. So, I mean, I personally need to replace one of my cars. I'm thinking about buying a Tesla Model 3. But the reason I'm doing that is because I think it's cool. And that particular model is reasonably affordable. At what point in terms of the production momentum are we going to get to the point where electric vehicles don't have a cost disadvantage?
Slightly complicated answer to that.
Well,
First of all, you're not the benchmark for the average customer. Yeah. We'll try to get to the answer. You can today still resuscitate the industry with the kind of large-scale envelope support that Pelino is talking about, but it is not at the vehicle level. It's actually at the parts level. Let's understand some cost dynamics here. A battery in a conventional vehicle, an IC engine, internal combustion engine, contributes to less than 2% of the cost. Batteries in electric vehicles will contribute to tens of percentages of the cost base, so 25, 30% of the cost base. Motors have a very different cost contribution to the overall bill of materials. Now, unless we as Canadians can get these large component pieces aligned, we will not be able to build the kind of industry that we need to be able to supplement today's industry. That's point one. Point two, the new industry is, I'm calling it the new industry, which is the new electrification industry. Let's understand, every industry has some political muscle. That's what is used to push the government to get regulation going. The automotive industry globally, the large players top out at 150, 160, 170 billion dollars. That's the muscle capital that they have to push regulation into a certain direction. On electrification, they start competing with digital players and energy players. The largest digital players top at 300, 400, 500 billion dollars. So a very different contribution size. And the largest digital players also top at that size. So it's a very different world that they're inheriting. You'll have to pardon the noise in the background. I did not manage to shut down the phone whilst this call was running.
We're all living the Zoom life now, Rahul. It's okay.
Yes. So there is that element which is there. What do we do with repurposing of assets, with fuel pumps, with electrification infrastructure, with companies themselves whose physical infrastructure will need to be repurposed? They will need to run 2, 3, 4 concurrent product lines in the short run. But those are the issues that we need to answer.
So that was really where I was going to go with that. I mean, so I'm the CEO of a tier 2 or tier 3 parts manufacturer.
Yeah.
I hear people like us talking about this. I mean, this has been part of my life for a period of time. One of those guys walks into your office and asks you what to do. What do you tell him? I suspect the answer is to get aggressive and get proactive. But what is the advice that you're giving these folks?
The first advice is, let's identify what part of the value chain can you participate in if you want to be in the automotive business. You can still be in other forms of the automotive business. You can be in charging infrastructure. You can be in motor manufacturing, which goes beyond automotive. But if you want to be in automotive business, what part of the product portfolio mix do you want to play in? The second is, what's your investable appetite? because it's easy to say you can mean motors, but motors can mean different things at different points of scale. And if you have a small manufacturer, there are only some components that they can actually graduate in and start playing in. So it is a time for a product pivot. It is a time for a portfolio refresh for most of these guys. But it's also a time to go back and question, where is maximum bang for buck going to come from? And how will you raise the kind of money that you need to essentially be able to participate in the new electrification value chain? And where will that money come from? The answer to the first two can be provided by consultants like us or by industry experts like Pelino. The answer to the last two have to actually come from the financial services industry. You have to find out a model in which you can support these suppliers making that transition, because they will need financial support. They will need restructuring of assets. They will need corporate restructuring. They will need portfolio reprint, because they might have to switch from Canada to Mexico if they have to really be valuable and viable. And that won't come from the banks. That would actually come from private industry, private equity industry, or financial markets, which are focused on these tier 2, tier 3 manufacturing base, because that's the bulk of the volume of players.
Yeah, and that's the challenge that I see, because if you're talking about tier 2 and tier 3 manufacturers, these are not public companies.
No,
for the most part.
No.
You're talking about values of companies of 50, 100, $150 million or smaller, who just don't have the financial access that the public companies have. And so, I mean, one of the things that we do every day is we help, potentially help companies access private capital. That's a big part of what we do. And, it's a big challenge sometimes to get, in the Canadian market, a relatively small number of private capital players to really understand these sorts of trends and to get comfortable in investing in them. It's a big issue. The US is a much deeper market. There are, quite a bigger percentage of private capital providers are deeply specialized in industry verticals. In Canada, because of the market size we have, much bigger percentage of private capital providers are generalists. You can go to the US, and we do that a lot for companies, but you're then dealing with big funders looking at relatively small companies. So there doesn't seem to be a really obvious, easy solution for these companies. And I go back to what I said previously. I think the real answer is to be proactive and get aggressive now, because there's going to be some lead time involved in doing the portfolio, selection exercise, in starting to cultivate financial partners and investors. It's going to take time. And my concern is that the financial business is not going to be ready for these folks when they get through that process. And so, I mean, one of the reasons we're doing this today is to raise some awareness of this, because we think that there's a massive challenge and opportunity for both investee companies and investors in helping make this transition.
Dave, if I may add to what you're saying, 5 years ago, when we started looking at the future of electrification, we felt that all electrification was at 2045. Now we have a concurrent view that it could hit by as early as 2040, maybe even 2035. So the forecast is actually shortening. And the problem is not that far away. It's not a problem that Canadian suppliers will face towards the end of this decade. It's a problem that Canadian suppliers might face as early as 2024, 25, which means they're really out of time now.
Which is that's today.
Yeah.
Right. That's today. That's tomorrow morning when you come into work. I mean, that's tomorrow morning to really get in a position where you've transitioned to business by 2024 in an industry like this. That's today.
The other issue is that why is private capital needed is because a lot of these suppliers are actually family owned, and they're also transitioning between generations.
Yeah, which is which is complex in and of itself, because I mean, another big part of our business is dealing with intergenerational wealth transfers, where you have, the proprietor of a business who's in his or her 50 or 60s or 70s and wants to transition the business. Are the kids ready? Do they want it? Are they qualified? Big issues. What is the role the family's going to continue to play? And the problem with those issues is they're simple in theory, but very difficult to deal with, and they take time, right? Which is another issue. Now, some good news about that. There are quite a few capital providers who are specializing in intergenerational wealth transfers because it's so common. But you layer that on top of an industry in turmoil, question becomes, when do you do the intergenerational transfer? Do you do it now, or do you transition the business and then do it later? And I think it's really quite interesting. I mean, the other thing which I think of, and maybe this is an oversimplification, but there are industries where you see a long-term decline, because it's not like IC engines are going to disappear tomorrow. They're going to, sounds like they're going to be phased out over the next, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years. There's probably a way to harvest a lot of those manufacturing businesses as they decline. You think about, it's a bad example, but the tobacco industry, has been in decline for decades and spins off incredible amounts of cash because they don't have anything to spend the money on. I mean, it may be that there's a portfolio approach. Maybe there's an M&A combined with a portfolio approach to harvesting some of those IC businesses as the transition is made. But M&A transactions themselves are difficult and threatening. I mean, this is a fascinating thing.
You raise an important issue about the true length of the transition, because I mean, the average age of a vehicle in Canada is 13 years, actually 15 in the United States. We're tougher on our cars than Americans are. But so think about that. If the last combustion engine vehicle is supposed to be sold in 2035, that means it's going to be around until at least 2050. Okay, so sure, the supply of parts for new vehicles in terms of combustion-based vehicles is going to be drying up in the next 14 years, assuming all of these targets stick. But the vehicles are still going to be around. You're still going to need gasoline infrastructure. You're still going to need replacement parts for quite some time thereafter. And it's going to be a messy, awkward, challenging transition to keep those cars on the road when there's declining numbers of them. But there are going to be some people still in that industry, right?
So I should know this fact, but how many cars and light trucks are out there?
24 million in Canada alone.
But those are new. Well, that's in Canada. What about North America? So
the United States is like 280 million vehicles.
Yeah, so you got 300 million vehicles that are getting replacement parts, servicing, etc., for at least 15 years.
Yeah.
Yes. So you can take a sunset strategy kind of approach. You can, but the problem is the kind of complexity it lends to your business. You have to pivot your business from manufacturing to managing SKUs. And they are very different businesses to run. One is a manufacturing business, the other is an aftermarket business.
And so I just imagine in 3 years, you're going to see a newspaper article talking about how some entrepreneurs decided to start, collecting these 10 years from now, collecting these,
Dave, I agree, but there'll be 2 suppliers who will make that transition for every 8 or 10 that will go bust. And the question is, for these suppliers, how do you maximize the value of your money today?
The successful companies to make the transition, I think, are going to be companies that see themselves as not manufacturers of a specific part. They're not in the carburetor parts business. They're in the parts business, and it may be metal parts, right? And are those metal parts going to be for a new vehicle? Are those metal parts going to be for the aftermarket business? Are the metal parts going to be for, electric vehicle charging stations and electric vehicle charging equipment, or home vehicle charging stations? If they're a maker of metal parts, how easily can they transform themselves to sell different metal parts, or rubber parts, or plastic parts, as the case may be, right? But it's going to be a challenge of flexibility. And, let's face it, for the past 100 years, you could have been a carburetor supplier for 100 years, and you would have been fine. but there's not going to be carburetors anymore, right? We're transitioning out of carburetors. So do you wind down your company, or do you transition it to producing something other than carburetors?
Well, so
Right.
I mean, these questions, you know, the term strategy is an overused term, right? But this is a strategic question, right? For all these companies, okay, you know, it becomes an existential question, I think, right? Which, you know, is not always easy to go through. So I see that our 45 minutes is now up. I think we'll probably end it at this point. What I would like to say is that, you know, from the point of view of both Roland Berger and Morrison Park, this is a challenge that, you know, we're gearing up to help companies with. You know, we do expect to work together in helping, you know, supply chain companies deal with these questions. You know, we're eager to do it. This is an area that we want to focus our time, attention, and our effort between, you know, Roland Berger's expertise on the strategic consulting side and our expertise with respect to identifying and raising private capital. We do think that we are ideally positioned to help people. But, you know, the key word is help. And you know, it's going to take time and it's going to take effort, but it is something we're keenly interested in focusing on. And, you know, obviously, you know, our contact details are available if anybody is interested in talking further about this. So on that note, I'd like to very much thank our two guests today, Rahul, Gangal, and Pelino, Colaiacovo. You guys obviously know what you're talking about. And, you know, one of the things we aspire to with respect to the webinar series is potentially coming back to topics to dig into them in more detail. And if there's demand from that from our audience, then we'll set one of those up to keep going on this. So on that note, thank you very much, guys, and we'll see everyone next time.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you so much. Pleasure being here. Thank you.